The evening that changed everything began with a joke about bolt tighteners. Dr. Priscilla Seton had been holding the room for 20 minutes by the time she made it, standing at the head of the Carlton Club's private dining suite with a laser pointer and the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being the most credentialed person in any space she entered. She was 43, held an endowed chair at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Applied Science, and had 2 weeks earlier returned from a federal advisory panel in Brussels, where she had told a room of European ministers exactly what was wrong with their approach to northern infrastructure. She said these things not because they were impressive, but because they were true, and in her experience, truth required a certain volume to be heard properly. The 22 people at the long table were not ordinary. Cameron Duff, who had booked the entire club for the evening, ran an infrastructure investment fund with more capital under management than most provincial budgets. 6 structural engineers sat in the middle of the table, 3 from private firms, 2 from federal agencies, 1 from a university in Alberta. There were 2 federal ministers, 4 investors, a pair of deputy ministers whose names appeared on framework documents Canadians never read, and Professor Broderick Kane at the far end, who was 72 and had been involved in northern engineering policy since before most of the room had finished their undergraduate degrees. Gerard Finlay, who managed the club's private events, had briefed his floor staff twice that evening. Nothing was to go wrong. He had put Ivor Macleish on corridor maintenance specifically because Ivor never made noise and never needed to be told a thing twice. Ivor Macleish was 61. He had worked as the club's facility supervisor for 7 years, arriving each morning before the kitchen staff and leaving after the last coat had been retrieved from the cloakroom. He was a wide-shouldered man with large hands and a face that people generally forgot 3 minutes after speaking to him, which he had come to understand was a form of professional road grace. He drove a 2009 Silverado he had bought used and parked 4 blocks away because the club's underground lot charged $32 a day, and he saw no reason to pay it. He pressed his own work shirts. He carried a folding rule in his back pocket out of habit, long after there was any practical reason to. The other facilities staff knew almost nothing about him. They knew he was widowed. A form somewhere in the HR files mentioned a daughter, second-year engineering at Dalhousie, which some of the younger staff found quietly moving without knowing why. They knew he ate lunch alone and read during it, always a paperback, never his phone. They knew he never stayed for the post-shift drinks, and that when he declined, he did it in a way that landed without edge. What none of them knew was that Ivor Macleish had, at 34, been the lead geotechnical engineer on the Clearwater River crossing, the most technically demanding suspension bridge built in northern Ontario in a generation, that his name had appeared on 3 peer-reviewed papers before he was 36, that a colleague at the National Research Council had once described his soil structure interaction model as the most elegant analytical framework to come out of Canadian civil engineering in 20 years, that the model now bore someone else's name in the industry literature. He had left the field at 38. His wife, Beatrice, had been diagnosed 2 months before the Clearwater project's completion. The professional tribunal that examined the authorship dispute reached its conclusion 4 months after the funeral in a government building on Spark Street, with Ivor on one side of a table and his former senior partner on the other with a lawyer. The committee ruled that the evidence was insufficient to make a clear attribution. Ivor thanked them, took his coat, and drove home to an apartment where his daughter was 8 years old and asleep with the hall light on. He had taken the club job 3 weeks later because the shifts were reliable, and nobody there had ever read an engineering journal. The work itself had not left him. It sat where he had placed it. The way a room in a house you have locked and stopped entering still exists behind the door. He simply no longer opened it. The night of Cameron Duff's dinner, Ivor was replacing a faulty ballast in the corridor light fixture directly outside the private suite's service entrance. The door was ajar 3 inches, enough for sound to pass, not enough to suggest anyone was listening. He was not listening. He was reading the wiring configuration through a penlight and thinking about nothing in particular. He heard Dr. Priscilla Seton's voice before he heard the words. She was explaining, to a room of professionals why the federal government's proposed approach to permafrost-sensitive bridge foundations in the Northern Corridor was, as she put it, a generation behind the science. She was not wrong about this. Ivor agreed with her entirely for the first 6 minutes. He could tell from the cadence of the room, the quality of the silence, the way questions were short and deferential, that nobody at the table was prepared to push back on her with any force. Then she wrote something on the portable whiteboard that Duff's people had brought in, and even through a 3-inch gap in a service door, Ivor saw the third-order approximation and understood immediately that it would not hold. It was not a catastrophic error. It was the sort of mistake that would survive 3 rounds of review and 20 years of operation and then fail quietly over 1 winter, in the slow progressive way that looked afterward like accumulated environmental stresses rather than a design assumption that had never been tested against seasonal frost heave cycling at depth. The kind of mistake that built bridges lasting 28 years instead of 60. He thought about walking away from it. He had walked away from larger things. But then Dr. Seaton said, with the particular lightness of someone who has no idea what is standing 3 feet behind a door, the beauty of this level of analysis is that it requires years of genuine immersion. It is not the kind of thing you arrive at by tightening bolts for a living. A few people at the table smiled. One laughed quietly. Ivor Macleish set down his penlight. He did not push the door open dramatically. He knocked once, waited 2 seconds, and stepped into the service threshold the way he might have stepped in to replace a bulb. He was holding a screwdriver. His work shirt had a small rust mark on the left cuff that he had noticed that morning and had not done anything about. "Pardon me." His voice was the same volume he used for everything. "I don't mean to interrupt. The third-order term in line 4 doesn't account for seasonal phase change at depth. If the frost heave cycling runs more than 2 meters, the approximation underestimates lateral load accumulation by roughly 18% over a 25-year service period." He said this the way a person reads a weather gauge. The room did not turn all at once. It turned the way a tide turns, from the center outward, until 22 faces had found the same 2 people. A woman in a charcoal blazer holding a laser pointer and a man in a work shirt holding a screwdriver, standing at the service entrance of a private dining room at 11 minutes past 9. Gerard Finlay appeared in the far doorway. Dr. Priscilla Seaton's expression performed a small, precise calculation. "I'm sorry," she said. "What is it you do here?" Ivor told her. He said he was the facility's supervisor. He said he was sorry to have interrupted and that she could ignore it, and he reached back for the door handle with his free hand. That would have been the end of it. But Quinn Baxter, who managed a sovereign wealth fund and had the specific alertness of a man trained to notice what other people missed, said from the middle of the table, not loudly but clearly enough, he said 18% over 25 years. Is that wrong? The room waited. Priscilla set her laser pointer on the table. She walked back to the whiteboard. She read the 3rd line again, and then the 4th, and then she did something small with her jaw that Ivor noticed and that no one else was positioned to see. She turned to face the room. "What the gentleman is referring to," she said, "is a simplifying assumption standard to preliminary analysis of this type. It appears in every federal guidelines document produced in the last 15 years. She turned slightly toward Ivor, including him the way a teacher includes a student who has raised a hand at an inappropriate moment. There are textbooks. There are continuing education modules through Engineers Canada. Most of them are free." She paused. What there isn't is a version of this discipline where 7 years of managing a building's mechanical systems is a substitute for 7 years of doctoral-level geotechnical work. That isn't elitism. That's just what the field costs. Ivor said nothing. He folded his hands behind his back, which was what he did when he needed to stop his body from broadcasting anything. Natasha Pelletier, who held the federal infrastructure portfolio and had spent 30 years watching professionals talk past each other in rooms like this one, asked without sharpness whether anyone had actually verified the claim or whether they were all simply enjoying the evening. Cameron Duff leaned back in his chair with the careful stillness of a man who had just realized his dinner was going to be more valuable than he had planned for. Priscilla reached for her bag without hurrying. She took out a checkbook and wrote, Ivor heard the pen against the paper from where he stood, and that told him how quiet the room had become. She walked to the head of the table and placed the check face up in front of Cameron Duff, where 22 people could read the figure. $500,000, she said. There is a whiteboard, a marker, and 11 engineers in this room who can verify any solution in real time. Demonstrate, tonight, in this room, that the approximation is materially flawed, that the error compounds as described, and that a corrected framework exists which can be analytically defended. Do that, and the money is yours, and I will apologize to you in front of every person at this table. She looked at Ivor directly. If you can't, you'll say out loud what this actually was, that you wanted to be noticed, that you saw a room full of people who have spent their lives on something serious, and you took a free swing at it, and then you will go back to your corridor. Cameron Duff looked at the check, then at Ivor. He said he would guarantee the amount personally, redeemable before Ivor left the building, so that no one in the room spent the next hour wondering whether the figure was real. Gerard Finlay began to say something about his staff. Duff looked at him once. Finlay stopped, because the man who had looked at him had underwritten 3 federal infrastructure bonds that calendar year and would be deciding in February whether to book the spring symposium. The room waited. Ivor Macleish understood every calculation available to him. He could apologize, step back into the corridor, and finish the ballast replacement. The job would still be there in the morning. He had spent 7 years constructing a life that was small enough to be carried safely, and every instinct built in those 7 years was telling him to protect it. He was also looking at the whiteboard. The thing that had happened at 32. The thing that had made a senior researcher write in a letter that Ivor Macleish saw the underlying structure of problems before most engineers had finished reading the question, happened again now without invitation and without effort. The third-order term was not just incorrect, it was a door. Priscilla had placed it there to simplify her presentation, and she had not noticed what it opened. He felt it move through him the way he had felt it 30 years ago, clear and cold and completely certain. Duff asked him his name. Ivor Macleish, he said. It was the first time all evening that anyone in the room had asked. He walked to the whiteboard. He took the marker from the tray, turned it once in his fingers to test the weight, and looked at the problem the way a man looks at a door he has not opened in a very long time. Priscilla asked him quietly whether he understood there was no version of this that ended well for him. Ivor uncapped the marker. "I'll start," he said. He did not begin at the top. That was the first thing the room noticed. He stood with the marker at his side for 90 seconds and read the existing derivation from the 4th line backward to the 1st. And to most of the engineers at the table, it looked like a man gathering himself in front of an audience. One of the federal engineers said something under his breath to the man beside him. A consultant from Calgary looked at her phone. At the end of the table, Professor Broderick Kane had not moved. He was watching the maintenance supervisor's eyes move across the board, and he was not smiling. Then Ivor wrote a single line. It was not a correction of Priscilla's work. It was a restatement of the fundamental problem in different variables. The same physical question stripped of the simplifying assumption and re-expressed as a statement about a material's behavior over time, rather than a constraint on a load calculation at a single moment. One of the federal engineers sat forward. Ivor kept writing. The lines came steadily, not fast. He did not show working the way a student shows working. He showed only the turning points, the places where the analysis changed direction, and left the straight sections to be followed without annotation. His handwriting was small and even and used abbreviations that were technically correct, but not common in academic presentation. Broderick Kane stood up. He was a large man and had been for 60 years, and when he stood in a room, rooms noticed. He walked around the end of the table and positioned himself where he had a direct sightline to the board, and stayed there with his arms at his sides. Priscilla watched him do this. At the 8-minute mark, Natasha Pelletier asked the table whether anyone could explain in plain language what was happening on the board. Kane answered without turning around. He said the gentleman had set aside the problem as written and was building the correct physical model from the material properties upward. He said he was not yet certain of the destination. Ivor reached a midpoint, stopped, recapped the marker, and studied what he had written the way a person checks a map before a turn. Then he uncapped it and drew a single line through 2 of his own steps, and replaced them with one that was shorter and broader in scope. "He's compressing steps he hasn't shown," one of the private firm engineers said. Nobody agreed out loud. That was the moment the room's character began to shift, and everyone at the table felt it before anyone could have named it. Because the notation on the board was not decorative. It was internally consistent. It held the constraints of the original problem and extended them in a direction that 3 or 4 people could verify in real time as each line appeared. 2 of them were already doing so, quietly, on the backs of the printed agenda sheets in front of them. Ivor finished at 14 minutes. He set the marker in the tray. He did not step back for effect or underline the final line. He turned around, put his hands behind his back, and waited. Broderick Kane went to the board. He read it once quickly, and then went back to the beginning and worked through it, with his finger pressed lightly against each line, moving slowly. When he reached the end, he removed his glasses. "It is correct," Kane said. "The corrected framework is analytically sound, and the compounding error is precisely as described, 18.3% over a standard 25-year service cycle under Northern Ontario permafrost conditions." He paused. "The derivation is also shorter than what I would have given you, and I have been working in this area since the Confederation Bridge planning phase." He walked to the left side of the board where Priscilla's original derivation still stood. "While I'm here," he said, and read that as well. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "The simplifying assumption in line 3 is not standard practice for this class of foundation problem. It is standard practice for preliminary desktop review. The distinction matters when results are being cited to a federal advisory body." He turned back to the room. "The gentleman's original observation was correct. I'd like that on record." The sound the table produced was not applause. It was a silence that contained something uncomfortable in it, because 22 people had just been told that the man in the work shirt had been right from the beginning about the very thing they had all smiled at. Priscilla came to the board. She read Ivor's derivation once at speed, and then again with her full attention. Ivor watched her arrive at the same place Kane had arrived. "The framework is novel," she said. "The elegance of this particular approach comes from a structural property of the problem that I didn't build in intentionally. These things happen to gifted graduate students, who then spend several years discovering that it doesn't happen on every problem." She turned to Cameron Duff. "One solution to one problem is an anecdote. You wouldn't fund an infrastructure program on the basis of a single evening." Duff said he had twice funded programs on the basis of a single conversation, and that both times it had been the right decision. One of the engineers from the Alberta firm said the fair thing, the rigorous thing, was a proper sample. Not one problem, but problems drawn from the active research of the engineers in the room with no preparation possible. Priscilla agreed before he had finished the sentence. That was how the next hour unfolded. The private dining room at the Carlton Club stopped resembling a dinner. Duff reorganized the seating. A second whiteboard was carried down from the boardroom on the 4th floor. The engineers were asked to submit problems from their own current work. Quinn Baxter appointed himself timekeeper using a watch he had been looking for an occasion to use. 4 problems went up over the next hour. The first came from a woman studying long-term settlement behavior of driven piles in clay-rich soils along the James Bay corridor, a question she had been working on for 18 months. Ivor solved it in 11 minutes and told her without any change in expression that the difficulty had probably come from treating the consolidation as linear when the clay structure in that region behaved non-linearly past a certain effective stress threshold, and that if she adjusted the constitutive model by a single parameter, the discrepancy in her field data would resolve. She wrote something in the margin of her agenda and did not speak for a quarter of an hour. The second was from the Alberta engineer, and he made a point of writing it slowly. It concerned the dynamic response of a cable-stayed bridge deck to combined wind and traffic loading, a problem he had been developing for a paper he expected to submit in the spring. Ivor looked at it for longer than he had looked at anything else that evening. Then he said he could not solve it. The room reacted to that more strongly than to any of the solutions. "I can't solve it," Ivor said, "because the claim it rests on in the second line is not supportable. The damping ratio assumed there has no experimental basis for this class of structure at this span length. There is published data from a Norwegian study in 2019 that puts the real value 40% lower. If you use the correct ratio, the conclusion in your paper inverts." He wrote the citation from memory. The engineer checked it on his phone in 20 seconds. He looked up and said nothing. The third and fourth problems went the way of the first. By the end of the hour, the character of the room had reversed so completely that engineers had begun asking Ivor questions between problems, the way people at a dinner party ask the specialist they have just realized they have been sitting next to all evening. Natasha Pelletier asked what he believed the most consequential unresolved question in northern infrastructure engineering currently was. Ivor answered her properly and specifically. Then he picked up the water pitcher from the service sideboard, moved along the near side of the table, and refilled the glasses of the 5 people whose glasses were empty. Nobody in the room knew how to account for that. Cameron Duff said out loud that it was the strangest thing he had seen at one of his dinners, and he had been hosting them for 11 years. Priscilla Seton had stopped speaking. She was standing near the second whiteboard with a glass she had not touched in 40 minutes, and she was watching him, not the board. Watching the way he held the marker between problems, low and loose, the way a person holds a tool they have used for most of their life. Watching that he had never once looked toward the pocket where the check had gone. After the fourth problem, she said quietly, so that only Kane and one other person heard, "A man doesn't develop this in a maintenance shop." Kane did not answer immediately. "I know where it was developed," he said. What happened next was where the evening stopped being a demonstration. The Alberta engineer pulled Priscilla aside near the service door. Ivor saw them from across the room, saw the engineer's hand moving, saw Priscilla shake her head once, and then stop shaking it. When they came back, the engineer was carrying a leather portfolio from the coat check. He announced that there was one more problem, not from a textbook, not from a preprint, from unpublished collaborative research that he and Dr. Seton had been developing for 11 months, which had been shared with exactly 3 people, all at institutions under signed confidentiality agreements. He wrote it on the clean board. It took him 6 minutes, and by the end it filled the entire surface. 2 of the engineers at the table read it and sat back in their chairs in a particular way. Broderick Kane told the room flatly it was not a fair problem. He said a question of that scope was 18 months of careful work, not an after-dinner exercise, and that whatever they believed they were establishing, this would not establish it. Cameron Duff asked Ivor whether he wanted to stop. The honest answer was that Ivor had wanted to stop 30 minutes ago. His hands had gone cold during the second problem and had not warmed since. Something he had closed and locked with real discipline and real cost over 7 years was now standing in the middle of the room in full light, but he had also read the board. "I'll look at it," he said. What followed was not like the first hour. Priscilla did not sit down. She stood 4 feet from the board and challenged the first line before the ink was dry, asking him to justify the substitution. He justified it. She asked why the substitution preserved the boundary condition for the anisotropic case. He addressed that too. The Alberta engineer positioned himself at the left edge of the board and challenged from that side, and between them they turned every step into a defense, and the room watched an examination being conducted in real time by 2 people who had spent the past 20 minutes planning the questions. 15 minutes in, the Alberta engineer said the word everyone had been carefully not saying. He said it as a hypothesis, in a measured tone, which is always how these things begin. "I want to understand," she said, "how someone in this gentleman's position moves through a problem that took Dr. Seton and me 11 months to formulate, at this speed, on the first attempt." Quinn Baxter said what the table had been thinking for 5 minutes. He asked whether it was possible the facility's supervisor had had prior access to the material. He said the dinner had been on the calendar for 6 weeks, that the guest list had circulated through the club. Someone asked who had access to the event file in the club management system. Ivor kept writing. It was the only thing he could do. He wrote and defended and wrote, and every third line he was made to stop and justify a step that had been second nature to him since he was 30 years old. He was 4 lines from the end when Priscilla moved. She stepped between him and the board and turned to face the room. Her voice was completely level. "I want everyone to look at the parametric framework in the middle section," she said, "specifically the way the soil stiffness degradation is encoded." Kane said the framework was correct. "It is," Priscilla said. "It is also the exact analytical structure that Cormac and I developed in March. Not equivalent to it, the same structure, the same encoding approach, the same auxiliary variable choice." She let the room hold that. "This work has not been presented anywhere, submitted anywhere, or circulated beyond 3 institutions under confidentiality agreement, and it appears reproduced from memory in front of 22 witnesses." Ivor set the marker in the tray. He could have said the true thing, that the encoding structure was the natural consequence of the problem's geometry, that any experienced geotechnical engineer attacking this question from first principles would build it, that its inevitability was precisely why the work was worth doing. He knew it. He could have demonstrated it in the time it took to write 6 lines. But he had sat in a room like this once before, in a different city, with different people, and he knew what a room sounds like when it is already decided. Gerard Finlay came through the service door, and this time no look from Cameron Duff stopped him. Finlay said that his club was not the venue for this, that a member of his staff was being accused of a serious matter in front of 22 guests, and that the evening was concluding. He turned to Ivor and said to come to the back office. Ivor looked at the board. 4 lines. He could see all 4 of them, complete, in the order they needed to go. He could see the final line, the one that closed the entire argument, and he understood that writing it would not matter at all, because the room was no longer asking whether he could do it. He walked past Priscilla Seton, past the whiteboard, past the head of the table where a man he had met 2 hours ago was sitting with $500,000 in his jacket. He went out through the service door into the corridor where the overhead light was amber, and the sound of the dishwashers was the only thing in the air. There was a folding chair in the corridor that had been there since a corporate function in November and had never been put away. Ivor sat on it with his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor tile. He was not thinking about the money. He wanted to be honest with himself about that at least. He was thinking about a committee room in a federal building on Spark Street 12 years ago in February, while his daughter was at her grandmother's, and the way the committee chair had said insufficient evidence in the same tone he might have used to report that the weather was expected to improve. The service door opened. He expected Gerard Finlay. It was Broderick Kane. The old man came in slowly and let the door fall closed behind him. He stood with his back against the wall, because there was one chair and Ivor was in it. "They're arguing," Kane said. "Duff wants the problem finished. The other engineer wants a call placed to his institution's integrity office tonight. Nobody has looked at the board in 15 minutes, which is the part that offends me." Ivor told him he was grateful for what Kane had said in there, and that it wouldn't change anything. "Probably not," Kane said. "I have been in this field 50 years, and I have watched rooms like that one make decisions that had nothing to do with the evidence in front of them." He looked down the corridor toward the kitchen light. "I reviewed a paper in 2003, a geotechnical paper. The listed first author was a senior partner at a firm I won't name. The analysis was the most sophisticated thing I had read in that area in a decade. I told the editor so. I was informed afterward that the original author had stepped back from the project. I assumed the field had handled it. I have carried that paper ever since." Ivor said nothing. "The accusation in that room has only one answer," Kane said. "Not argument. Arguments are what put you in that chair." He explained what he intended to do. Write a problem himself, on the spot, from an idea he had been keeping in his head for 3 years and had spoken aloud to no one. Something composed in front of every person in that room, out of nothing that had existed 60 seconds before. If Ivor solved it, the accusation would collapse on its own weight, without anyone needing to be argued out of anything. Ivor asked him why he was doing it. The old man thought about the question for longer than Ivor expected. "Because you refilled the water glasses," Kane said. "In the middle of the third problem, you came off the board, picked up the pitcher, and went around the table. He looked at Ivor directly. A man running a deception doesn't do that. A man running a deception is concentrating on the deception. They went back in together. Kane did not ask permission. He walked to the center of the room and waited for the arguments to stop, the way a person waits for a noise to pass before speaking. "Before I do anything else," he said, "I want one thing said in front of all of you, because it should have been said 40 minutes ago, and I was the one who should have said it." He looked at the Alberta engineer and then at Priscilla. The analytical structure in question is not proprietary. It is the natural construction. Any engineer who attacks that foundation problem seriously and completely will build it within 48 hours, because it is the only encoding in the neighborhood that preserves the problem's geometry. You both know that, and the reason you know it is that it's why you thought the work was worth writing. No one answered. What happened in this room tonight was a man arriving at the only available door and being told he must have stolen the key. The Alberta engineer looked at the portfolio in his hands. Priscilla looked at neither Kane nor the portfolio. Kane walked to the second whiteboard and erased its entire surface in 4 long strokes. The engineer said Kane's name sharply. "Sit down," Kane said. The engineer sat down, because there are still certain men in every field who can produce that effect without raising their voice. Kane told the room what he was going to do. He said he would compose a problem now, in front of all of them, from an idea he had been keeping unwritten for 3 years, an idea he had not sketched, not spoken, not put in front of any other person. He said the engineer and Dr. Seaton were welcome to stand beside him and watch his hand form every character. He said that if anyone could explain the mechanism by which a man steals something that did not exist 60 seconds ago, he was prepared to hear the explanation. Nobody offered one. Kane wrote for 8 minutes. He wrote slowly, with an old man's handwriting and careful spacing, and the room stayed quiet enough that the marker was audible the entire time. When he finished, he stepped back without commentary. The engineers at the table read it. Their reaction told the investors everything. The pile settlement researcher said quietly that she wouldn't know where to begin. Natasha Pelletier said it seemed less like a single problem than the opening of a branch of inquiry she hadn't previously encountered. The Alberta engineer read it for a long time and said nothing, and that silence was its own form of confirmation. Cameron Duff asked how long a well-resourced team should expect to require. Kane said he would expect serious progress to take the better part of a year. Priscilla asked whether Kane knew the answer himself. "No," Kane said. "That is the point. I can verify a proof. I cannot supply one." He held the marker out toward Ivor. The room turned. 22 people, most of them standing now, the dinner plates still on the table under low light. Gerard Finlay in the doorway with his arms at his sides, no longer attempting to end the evening. Ivor took the marker. He read Kane's problem. Then he read it again, and the second time through he felt the true size of it. Kane had written something with no purchase anywhere on its surface, no familiar shape, no symmetry that could be attacked, no structural feature he recognized in any form. Ivor understood within the first 2 minutes that nothing he had used that evening would be useful here. He stood without writing for 5 full minutes. Someone near the window said, almost inaudibly, that he was finished. The Alberta engineer said nothing. Ivor noticed that, and it meant the engineer was watching carefully for the first time all night. At the 6-minute mark, Ivor set the marker in the tray, walked to the long table, and picked up a linen napkin. He came back and used it to clean a section of the board, roughly 2 feet square in the lower right corner. He began writing there, not at the top, in the corner, small in notation that no one in the room immediately recognized. Broderick Kane moved closer. Ivor was not attacking the problem directly. He was constructing something beside it, a translation, a reframing. A way of expressing Kane's question in a different mathematical language in which the original difficulty simply did not exist in the same form, where the hardest part of the problem was not a wall to climb but a distinction that dissolved when you changed the vocabulary in which it was stated. Kane put his glasses back on. The pile settlement researcher stood and moved around the table to see the corner of the board. Then the woman from the federal agency. Then 2 more, and within 4 minutes, there were 8 people standing in a half circle around a whiteboard in a private dining room in Ottawa in the middle of the night, and none of them were speaking. Ivor kept writing. The translation took 22 minutes. The argument on the other side of it took 11. He covered both boards and had to erase a section of his own earlier work to complete the final 4 lines. He wrote the last line, capped the marker, and set it in the tray. Then he stepped back, and for the first time since he had picked up that marker 3 hours ago, he let out a slow breath. Kane read it the way a judge reads a decision he expects to be binding. He went through it at speed, then returned to the beginning and worked through every line with his finger tracking the text, and it took him 23 minutes, and no one in the room sat down or left or spoke. He stopped twice and asked Ivor a question. Both times Ivor answered in a single sentence, and Kane nodded and continued. When Kane reached the end, he turned and faced the room. It is correct. He waited for that to settle. I want to be precise, because precision is the only thing I have left to offer tonight. His voice did not rise. He did not solve the problem. He made the problem unnecessary. He found a change of framework in which my question becomes a natural consequence of structures already well established, and I have been carrying that question for 3 years and never saw the reframing. I have supervised 38 doctoral students. I have not watched anyone do that in a single evening. He removed his glasses and held them. There is one more thing I would rather say now than leave for people to piece together afterward. 22 years ago, there was a paper in geotechnical engineering describing a soil structure interaction model for variable saturation permafrost conditions. The listed first author was a senior partner at a firm I will not name. The analysis was the most sophisticated thing I had read in that area in a decade. I told the editor so. I was informed afterward that the original author had stepped away from the project. I assumed the field had handled it correctly. He paused. It didn't. He has been managing this building's mechanical systems 4 blocks from my office for 7 years, and it took a public humiliation to get him back in front of a board. I intend to sit with that for some time. I would invite everyone here to do the same. The applause that began near the window was not the careful applause that rooms like this one produced when they were being polite. It went on long enough to become uncomfortable, and then continued. Cameron Duff was standing, Natasha Pelletier was standing, Quinn Baxter had his hand over his mouth. Ivor was looking at the floor near the base of the whiteboard. His hands had started shaking now that they were no longer holding anything. The Alberta engineer left through the main door quietly and did not return. His paper was withdrawn from submission 9 days later. The error in the damping ratio assumption was attributed in the revision to a private communication. Priscilla Seton remained. She stood in the same place she had stood for the past hour, and when the applause finally stopped, she was the only person in the room who had not made a sound. Everyone present understood what was owed. Everyone present understood who owed it, and the room went quiet in the particular way that is harder to sit inside than any argument. She walked to the head of the table. "Give it to me," she said to Cameron Duff. He took the check from his inside pocket and placed it in her hand. She looked at it, then she crossed the 12 feet between herself and Ivor Macleish and held it toward him. "I said in this room that building management experience is not a substitute for doctoral-level training. Then I accused you of theft." Her voice did not waver, which made it harder to listen to. "I did that because I could not construct any other explanation for what I was watching, and I would rather have been dealing with a thief than with the alternative. The alternative is that I was wrong about who you were from the moment you opened your mouth, and that everything after that was me defending the error instead of examining it." Professor Kane checked the original concern in 2 minutes. I had 2 hours and a whiteboard, and I never looked. She held the check out to him. $500,000 in front of every person in this room, as promised, and the apology, also as promised. I would like the record to show that the apology is not for losing. Ivor took it. He looked at it for a moment, then folded it once and placed it in the breast pocket of his work shirt. Not in an apron, he was not wearing one. His work shirt, with the rust mark on the left cuff that he had noticed that morning and had not done anything about. Several people in that room described that detail to others for years afterward. Not the solutions, not the applause, the rust mark on the cuff, and the fold of the check going into the shirt pocket like a receipt. "Thank you," he said. He did not add anything. Priscilla waited for more and did not receive it. Ivor understood that the absence of it was the only mercy he had to give her that cost him nothing. What followed took 40 minutes, and Ivor remembered very little of it clearly. Cards came out. Cameron Duff described a research position before he had finished specifying what the research would be, and said he would build the terms around whatever Ivor wanted to work on. Natasha Pelletier said the infrastructure framework review beginning in the spring would benefit from his involvement, and that she would ensure the right people knew his name. 2 university representatives mentioned mechanisms that existed for candidates who had not completed doctorates under particular circumstances. Quinn Baxter gave him a card and said, without any performance in it, that he had been difficult about the temperature of the water served at dinner and was sorry. Ivor thanked all of them. He accepted nothing that night. Broderick Kane was the last to leave. He stood at the service entrance pulling his coat on, with the unhurried care of a man who had decided some time ago that rushing served very little purpose. "Most of them will call tomorrow," Kane said. "Some want the story, 2 want the work." Ivor asked which 2. Kane told him, then he left. Gerard Finlay found him afterward in the service corridor, dismantling the portable whiteboard panels and stacking them against the wall because the events crew had gone home and someone had to do it. Finlay told him to leave it. Ivor said it was his corridor. The 2 men stood across 2 folded whiteboards and the remains of a dinner that had stopped being a dinner 3 hours earlier, and Finlay said that he had spent the entire evening trying to protect a staff member and had spent it protecting the wrong thing. The job was there as long as Ivor wanted it. He also said, with the honesty of a man who ran a business, that he did not expect Ivor to want it much longer. Ivor gave notice the following morning and worked an additional 3 weeks because he had committed to shifts and other people would have had to cover them. He did not take Duff's offer. The money was significant, and the work would have belonged to someone else's organization, and he had learned at 38 precisely what it cost to hand a piece of yourself to an institution and trust it would come back. He took one of the 2 that Kane had named, a research position at a university that agreed in writing, before he signed anything, that his name would appear first on any work he generated, and that he would choose his own problems. Kane was listed as collaborator on the first paper. The old man insisted on second author and would not be moved on that point. The check cleared. Ivor paid off the remaining 2.5 years of his daughter Caitlin's tuition at Dalhousie in a single transfer, moved to an apartment where he no longer had to park 4 blocks from his own front door, and started working at his desk in the mornings again for the first time since he was 38. Caitlin called him the night the tuition cleared, laughing and slightly alarmed in equal measure. He told her a shorter version of the evening. The way you tell a story to someone who will need several years to understand all of it. She said, "Dad, why didn't you ever tell anyone?" He thought about the question for a moment. "I told you," he said. "I just waited until I had something to show." The message that came out of that room was a simple one, and several people who had sat at that table spent the following year rearranging parts of their professional lives around it. Knowledge does not announce itself. It does not need the right title, the right institution, or the right room to exist. It asks only for the right problem at the right moment, with enough honesty in the air to let it be seen for what it is. Put it in front of something hard and real, and every assumption about where brilliance is permitted to live will go quiet on its own.